please come to order? Today we will receive the testimony of Mr. Ronald Reagan, the former Chief of Staff of the White House. Welcome, sir. Will you please rise? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Questioning this morning will be started by Mr. Smiljanovich. Mr. Smiljanovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Regan, I understand you had a slight voice problem yesterday. If you just be sure to lean over and speak into the microphone, we'll all be able to hear.
Thank you. I still have it.
Okay, sir. You could perhaps pull it a little closer to you.
How's that?
That's fine. All right.
Good.
All right, Mr. Regan, you served as Chief of Staff to the President from February of 1985 until March of this year. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. You got your degree from Harvard in 1940 and then joined the Marine Corps and fought in World War II. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps?
That's right.
All right. And immediately after the war, you joined the firm of Merrill Lynch as a trainee. And
Yes.
approximately 30 years later, you had risen to the top of the ladder there and were Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. You joined the Reagan administration in 1981 as Secretary of the Treasury and served for 4 years until you became Chief of Staff in February of '85.
That's right.
All right, sir. Now, obviously, the role of Chief of Staff to the President depends very heavily on what the President wants from his Chief of Staff. How did you perceive your role as Chief of Staff to the President?
Well, when I took over as Chief of Staff from the then Chief of Staff, now Secretary of the Treasury, Jim Baker, actually there was a troika reporting to the President. Ed Meese as his counselor, Mike Deaver as the Deputy Chief. Meese had already been nominated to be Attorney General, and Mike Deaver had told us that he was going back into the private world. And as a result, I inherited all three of those jobs. So my tenure as Chief of Staff differed from the first 4 years of the Reagan administration as a single Chief of Staff. More of a pyramidal structure, I would describe it. The job of the Chief of Staff is a complicated one, but a nebulous one. It's whatever the President wants it to be. Each President does things a little bit differently. There was a recent symposium of former Chiefs of Staff, and they each described their job. And each one of them had a different experience as Chief of Staff. In my particular case, my first job, of course, was to see that the White House ran. That is, that from an administrative point of view, it functioned. If the President were to deliver a speech, the speech was ready on time and that he was comfortable with it. If he were going someplace, to make certain that all of the movements were there on time and correctly done. And of course, then there was the role of advisor, in which either I would offer an opinion or he would ask my opinion on a particular subject. Since this hearing has to do with the National Security Council, I think at the outset maybe I should describe that relationship.
Go ahead.
The National Security Council has been created by the Congress. The job of Chief of Staff was not created by the Congress. That's something that a president sets up, whatever way he wants. There are several, I guess you'd call them agencies, that are part of the White House staff that have relationships with the Chief of Staff: the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Economic Advisors, the President's National Scientific Advisor, things of that nature. Now, all of these report to the President through the Chief of Staff. However, the National Security Council and the National Security Advisor report directly to the President. If you think back, this is a traditional way for it to happen. In the days of Henry Kissinger, one of the better-known national security advisors, he reported directly to the President, not through the Chief of Staff Haldeman. In the Carter administration, Mr. Brzezinski, Dr. Brzezinski, reported directly, not through Hamilton Jordan. In the Reagan administration, strangely enough, the first National Security Advisor, Richard Allen, reported through the counselor to the President, Ed Meese, to the President. When Bill Clark came in to replace Richard Allen, that was changed. Bill Clark had been Ronald Reagan's chief of staff when he was governor of the state of California. So as a result, it was decided he would report directly to the President, in other words, back to the old mold. When Bud McFarlane replaced Bill Clark, that relationship's continued, the National Security Advisor reporting directly. He did not report to Jim Baker or through Jim Baker. When I came in, that relationship continued that way. Then, when Admiral Poindexter replaced Bud McFarlane, it was definitely continued the same way. He would report directly to the President, not through and not to the Chief of Staff.
When Admiral Poindexter became the National Security Advisor to the President, did the working relationship between you and the Office of National Security Advisor change in any way?
No, it did not.
All right. And the NSC staff reported through both Mr. McFarlane and Admiral Poindexter to the President rather than through you?
That is correct.
All right. When Admiral Poindexter became National Security Advisor, rising from the position of deputy, did you explain your working philosophy to him that there should never be surprises, particularly unpleasant surprises?
Yes, I explained that to just about anybody who worked in the White House.
Okay. Now, your advice to the President included matters of national security?
When he would ask for them. Initially, not so much. Later on, particularly leading up to Geneva and then later into Reykjavik, yes.
And you were one of the President's senior advisors?
I would say so, yes.
And part of your job was also to work with Congress and establish a good relationship between the President and Congress?
Yes, it was.
All right. Now, you attended on a pretty regular basis the morning briefings that the President received from the National Security Advisor?
Yes, I did.
These usually occurred at 9:30 in the morning?
That's correct.
And they were usually attended by the President, the Vice President, yourself, the National Security Advisor, and his deputy?
That's right.
Were any notes kept of those briefings?
I noticed that the deputy normally kept notes. I thought he was taking notes. To my surprise, I learned later he really wasn't taking notes so much as they were just jotting down things to do or reminders of papers that the President might ask for or something of that nature. I thought they were actually note takers, but apparently there were no notes taken. I didn't take any, and I know neither the President nor the Vice President took notes.
But at any rate, this 15 to 20-minute or 30-minute session with the President was the National Security Advisor's daily audience with the President to bring to him matters he felt it was important for the President to know?
That's right.
All right. Now, the President also received at this daily briefing reading material which summarized certain things and brought certain matters to his attention?
He did.
How did he receive these? Directly from the National Security Advisor?
Yes. It was it's not too different than this. And contained in it the papers for the President to read, intelligence summaries from various agencies. And it would be given to the President as the National Security Advisor was leaving the room, left with the President to read. He would read it right away, usually, if he had time, his schedule was open, and then pass it back directly to the National Security Council by way of his secretary to the National Security Advisor.
Did the National Security Advisor on occasions give the President memos and matters for him to sign directly by that process?
Yes, he did on occasion.
All right. When he would do that, would that paperwork become a part of the normal White House paper chain?
No, it didn't, and I protested that several times.
All right. Who did you protest to?
The National Security Advisor.
Was anything done about that to correct that process?
I thought it had, but I find out now from some of these hearings that it hadn't.
In other words, certain material that obviously got to the President were material that did not pass through you or that you saw.
That's right. It was not part of the normal paper flow.
Now, in addition to the daily national security briefings, you also attended meetings of the National Security Council?
I did.
Right. NSPG meetings?
Yes.
All right. And even on occasion, meetings with heads of state or summit meetings, that type of matter?
Yes.
All right. You were one of the President's senior advisors?
Yes.
All right. Now, who controlled the access of people to the President in the Oval Office?
As far as the President's schedule is concerned, I was in charge of that after Mike Deaver left. Deaver was in charge of it up until May of '85, and then I took over.
So it was the general practice that if someone wanted to come see the President, they had to go through you?
That's correct.
All right. Now, there were exceptions to that general rule, is that correct?
Yes, there were. There were 4 or 5 people who had the authority to go directly to the President, obviously the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the medical doctor, and the military aide on duty. The instructions have been left with the President's secretary. At any time any one of those people wanted to see the President, they were granted access.
Now, the Director of Central Intelligence at the time, William Casey, was a very close friend of the President, is that correct?
That's right.
In fact, he had served as a campaign manager to the President in the 1980 campaign?
Yes.
All right. Did Director Casey have such direct access to
No.
the President? Were there occasions in which Director Casey could meet with the President and exclude you from the meeting?
If the Director told me that he had something I'll best describe as hot, or some particular piece of information that he thought the President should hear, and he wanted to do it alone, I'd put him on the schedule.
Okay. And there were, in fact, occasions when Director Casey exercised that privilege and met with the President alone during your tenure?
Yes, he did.
And there were also occasions when the President met alone with the National Security Advisor without you being present?
That's right.
And on occasions, these were times when they specifically wanted to talk to the President alone without anyone else being present. Is that
That's
correct?
right. Mm-hmm.
Now, let's turn for a moment to the Nicaraguan resistance, or the Contras. The Contras and their success or failure were much on the President's mind during your tenure. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
All right. And much time was spent at the White House attempting to get Congress to repeal the Boland Amendment?
Yes.
All right. Now, the Tower Board report quotes the President as saying that he did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras during the 1985-1986 timeframe. Did you know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras?
Well, I knew that Lieutenant Colonel North would speak to various groups. I knew that through our public liaison person at the White House, who, when meetings were set up, people brought into the White House for purposes of discussing the freedom fighters. North was one of the ones that they had as a briefer.
Well, other than these types of jawboning activities, were you aware or familiar with any of Colonel North's other activities in connection with helping or assisting the Contras?
No.
Paramilitary assistance, that type of thing?
No.
All right. Did you ever ask Mr. McFarland or Admiral Poindexter who was filling the void created by the fact that the CIA could not engage in activities in Central America on behalf of the Contras?
No, I did not.
All right. Well, in any of the legislative strategy sessions, you did have strategy sessions in connection with attempting to get Congress to change its mind about assistance to the Contras. Is that correct?
Yes, we did.
Right. In any of those sessions, did anyone ever suggest that the NSC staff was already helping to coordinate assistance to the Contras?
No, not in that sense of the word. The NSC staff, and particularly when Bud McFarland was there and he enjoyed such good relationships with the Congress, he was in charge of our legislative efforts. But as far as in the field or relationships with the Contras outside of the legislative process, I never got into that.
Well, in any of these sessions, did anyone ever suggest that even if the Boland Amendment could not be repealed, that the NSC staff could continue to engage in many activities which would assist the Contras in Central America?
I'm not conscious of any discussions of that in the legislative sessions or other sessions.
Mr. McFarland told this committee that he believed that the Boland Amendment applied to the National Security Council staff. Admiral Poindexter testified that he believed that the Boland Amendment did not apply to the National Security Council staff, and that indeed the National Security Council had taken over the role of the CIA in Central America. Now, you were Chief of Staff during the tenure of both of those gentlemen. What did you know or understand about that subject?
Well, I never looked into the legalities of the Boland Amendment. I've never had the privilege of being a lawyer, and I didn't think that I knew enough to be able to opine as to whether or not this was legal, who should do it, who could do it, who couldn't do it. I left that up to the NSC.
Well, given the importance of the Contras and their costs to the President, and given the fact that you did attend daily briefings and meetings of the National Security Council, were you even aware that there was such a dramatic difference of opinion between these successive national security advisors about this subject?
No, I was not.
It never came up in any of the briefings you attended?
No.
Did you ever inquire, did you ever make any inquiry to determine what was going on with regard to assistance to the Contras during the Boland Amendment period?
No, that was outside my purview.
Admiral Poindexter testified that he kept the President briefed generally about the activities of the NSC staff. What do you remember about any such discussions with the President?
Well, the President obviously got briefings as to the status of the insurgency and how well or how poorly the freedom fighters were doing because either of lack of equipment or if they had equipment, how well they were using it. But from the point of view of who was running the operation or the details of the operation, that was never discussed in my presence with the President.
The President was never told, at least in meetings that you attended, that there were private benefactors who were assisting the Contras. Was he ever told that?
The President did know that there were private benefactors. As a matter of fact, on occasion he would do a drop-by if they were brought into the White House to discuss with these people. I recall one where we were told that there were a group of benefactors in who were raising money for a TV ad and newspaper ads in support of the freedom fighters. And the President did go in and talk to such a group for about 5 minutes, so he had to be aware that there were efforts of this nature.
Were you aware that at least some people in these groups were providing help with regard to lethal aid to the Contras?
No, I was not. We were told, I remember the President being told that a woman had supplied a helicopter for the Contras, but it was a medevac type of ship, not a lethal type.
Now, the committee has heard testimony about an NSPG meeting that was held on May 16, 1986, and if you need to refer to it, in front of you is a classified excerpts from that particular meeting. Yes, that one right there. This NSPG meeting involved discussion about possible alternatives of funding for the Contras in mid-1986. One of the options discussed in there was seeking third country help or assistance. First of all, do you have a general recollection of that meeting?
A general recollection, yes.
At the time of that meeting, were you aware that what we refer to as country number 2, and by the way, do you have that list in front of you? If not, I think probably the Washington Post has it.
Okay. I didn't bring my copy.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
At any rate, were you aware that country number 2 had made large contributions of funds for the Contras?
No, I was not.
All right. At any time, were you ever told that?
No.
All right. Looking down the list of countries, were you aware of any of those countries having been solicited or actually providing funds for the benefit of the Contras?
No, I was not aware of it.
Did you know that the NSC staff was engaged in seeking such contributions from other countries?
No.
Mr. McFarland?
Well, wait a minute, hold
Excuse
it.
me.
I do recall that at this particular meeting here, it was agreed that the State Department and perhaps the CIA, I'm not certain on that one, would solicit funds, and it would be coordinated by NSC. So to that extent, I was aware that the NSC would be in that process of seeking funds.
This was pursuant to the legislation which authorized the State Department to solicit third countries?
That's correct.
All right. Now, the committee has heard testimony that Secretary Schultz went back and that through his Assistant Secretary, Elliot Abrams, the country of Brunei was picked and, in fact, solicited and agreed to make a major contribution. The committee has also heard testimony that the $10 million that they agreed to contribute never reached the appropriate bank account. After this May 9 NSPG meeting in 1986, did anyone ever explain to you and the President where the Contras were getting their funds during this time that they were in such desperate need of funds?
At no time when I was with the President did anyone explain to him by name, by country, by amount. No.
Right. But the President was, in fact, concerned about the Contras and seeing to it that they would continue to survive as a viable factor in Central America.
Oh, yes.
All right. We'll turn to, if you would, in your exhibit book in front of you,
Which one is that?
the one with all the tabs.
This one? Okay.
All right. Would you turn to Exhibit 58?
58?
Yes, sir. Exhibit 58 is a series of notes that were taken by Mr. Rod McDaniel. Now, who is Mr. McDaniel?
Mr. McDaniel was the Executive Secretary, I believe, of the NSC.
All right. And during a large portion of 1986, he attended the daily briefings with the
Yes, he
Security
did. During
Advisor?
the illness of Don Fortier, in particular, McDaniel was there.
All right. Well, these are his notes from various meetings that were held during that time frame. The very first note in Exhibit 58, do you see the one that it's dated March 20?
Yes, I do.
All right. There's a notation there. It says 60 days stocks. It says Contras, 60 days stock after 31 March. This is the type of information that the President was receiving at his daily briefing about the status of the Contras?
Yes, because, well, let's see, this would have been is this 1986?
Yes, sir.
This would have been Admiral Poindexter telling the Presidency of the urgency of getting the passage of the bill through the Congress because of the low level of stocks.
And the President was being told that, in fact, the Contras only had about 60 days' worth of stock.
That's right.
All right, if you'll turn about 5 pages into these notes to one dated June 20. The number at the top is N9016.
I have it.
All right. It says there, again, another McDaniel note of the President's daily briefing. It says, Contras, 30 days ammo left. Again, this is the type of information that the President was
That's
receiving.
right. And then that's followed by some names and the like, which is a clear indication these are members of Congress that they are urging the President to contact in order to advise them of the perilous situation of the Contras and urge passage of the bill.
Okay. Now, this is pretty detailed information to be given the President at a 15-minute session with them on national security matters. It's indicative, is it not, of the fact that the President was very concerned about the ongoing status of the Contras and their ability to survive.
Well, in this case, it was the ongoing legislation and the legislative effort to get that passed. That time was passing is what they're trying to tell them here. It's already June. Their stocks are down. You've got to get moving here to get the Congress to pass the additional help.
The appropriated funds were not available until much later in 1986. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. Well, during that time period when appropriated funds were not available, when the solicitation that the State Department was authorized to engage in was not being successful, when the President was being told that the Contras were running very low on supplies, what understanding did you have, or what inquiries did you make about how the Contras were receiving funds or getting by during that period?
I made no inquiries of my own, again, feeling that this was outside of my area. This was more in the area of not only the National Security Advisor, but the State Department, CIA, and others. So, from a personal point of view, I have no knowledge of that. I was only there if the President were being told at a 9:30 briefing about what the situation was.
Well, at any of these briefings, did the President exhibit any curiosity about where the Contras were getting their money from?
I don't recall his asking specifically that, no.
But you were aware of the fact that you were not aware of the fact that the NSC had any operational role in connection with the Contras in Central America?
No, I don't think we were ever told that they had an operational role.
You were, however, aware of the fact that the NSC had an operational role in connection with the Iran initiative?
Yes.
All right, let's turn to that now. Your first knowledge of any initiative being attempted in connection with the government of Iran took place in July of 1985 when Mr. McFarland wanted to see the President, who was recovering in the hospital from an operation?
That's right. It was at Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Right. At that time, Mr. McFarland presented to the President the possibility of an opening to Iran that the Israelis were working on?
Yes.
All right. Now, did he, do you recall him mentioning anything in connection with arms as being a part of this process?
I don't remember arms being discussed at the time in the hospital. The doctors had warned me and had warned Bud McFarland that he couldn't stay long with the President, that we should get in and get out. It was only I guess the third day after his operation. So accordingly, the discussion was kept to a minimum. What McFarland was trying to do was to find or get permission from the President to initiate such discussions in order to have authority to continue, or rather to undertake, in accordance with what the Israelis had suggested, some openings to these Iranian persons who at that point were unknown factors.
All right, sir. Well, before that session in the hospital, on July 13, 1985, there's an exhibit number 2 in your book, which is a cable that Mr. McFarland sent to the Secretary of State. Now, I realize it doesn't show that you received a copy of this or that you ever saw it. But at any rate, in mid-July of 1985, Mr. McFarland was advising the Secretary of State that part of this plan involving the government of Iran contemplated the delivery of 100 TOW missiles to Iran, and that in connection with that, the hostages might be released. Your recollection is this was not brought to the President's attention at this first meeting in the hospital?
Not at the first meeting. I believe that was at the second meeting, which would have been after the President returned from the hospital to his quarters.
Right. In August of 1985, the committees heard testimony about a meeting that the President held with the Secretary of State, yourself, and others, in which Mr. McFarland discussed this particular Israeli initiative. Was it at that meeting that you recall the arms being mentioned for the first time?
I believe so.
All right. And you understood that a part of this plan was that Israel would ship some type of munitions to the government of Iran, and it was also presented to you and the President that Israel would contemplate or expect the United States to replenish those munitions or missiles that were shipped to Iran.
What I recall is, it's quite curious. I'll tell you why I recall it so vividly. In explaining what we're attempting to do and to open up this Iranian contact and start discussions with emissaries from that country, it was said that they were suspicious of the people with whom they were dealing. That is, how high up in the United States government did they go? On the other hand, we were suspicious of them. Did they really represent a reputable portion of the Iranian government, if there is such a thing? And as a result, they used a curious word. They said we'd have to show our bona fides. Well, as an old Latin scholar, that's sort of growing right on my nerves of a bona fides. But anyway, we would show our bona fides by using weapons, which was a common currency in the Middle East. And in return, we were going to ask for their bona fides, which would be that they would use their best efforts to cut down on terrorism, to haul in or rein in any terrorists over whom they had influence, and at the same time they would use their best efforts over the kidnappers of the American hostages to secure the release of the hostages. That's the way it was presented.
So in connection with this matter, our currency was TOW missiles or munitions, and their currency was terrorism and hostages.
That's right.
Now, in September...
But it didn't start out, I hasten to add, before anyone gets the impression that this started out as strictly an arms for hostage deal, and I know there has been a lot of controversy about that. The That was the, down number 3 and 4. The first purpose, obviously, was to start this dialogue with Iran, very important nation, a crossroads between East and West, that we should do all we could to make certain that we had an anti-Soviet Iran. A pro-Soviet Iran, stretching as it does from the Caspian to the Persian Gulf, would give the Soviets the warm water ports they had been looking for centuries. So we decided that we should try to open up a dialogue with Iran. That was the first purpose of it.
But the first step in the process was this exchange of bona fides.
That's right.
All right. In September of 1985, Mr. McFarlane specifically advised you and the President that the Israelis had in fact shipped 500 TOW missiles to Iran. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. Is it your testimony that that you and the President did not know prior to that shipment of TOW missiles that Israel intended to do so?
I certainly did not know it, and I have no recollection of anyone telling the President in my presence about the shipment prior to its being done.
All right. What was said at that meeting in September of 1985 about the replenishment of the missiles that Israel had shipped to Iran?
The President was quite upset that his hand was being forced this way. He still wasn't certain because he had told McFarlane in the August 6th meeting to go slow on this and let's make sure that we know who we're dealing with before we get too far into this. And as a result, to have his hand forced that way was quite upsetting. And he said, as far as any replenishment is concerned, we'll cross that bridge later. I'm not going to do anything about that now.
It would be fair to say that he did not rule out the possibility at that time.
He didn't, but he didn't volunteer to do it right away either.
Right. Moving then to the Geneva summit, which took place in November of 1985. You attended that summit with the President?
I did.
All right. And during that summit, we've heard testimony about Mr. McFarlane telling you and the President about an ongoing shipment of Hawk missiles, which Israel was engaged in at the time.
That's right.
What is your recollection of what Mr. McFarlane told you and the President?
Prior to the time we left, I recall just a momentary conversation. This was not a detailed briefing to the President that there was something up between Israel and Iran. It might possibly lead to getting some of our hostages out, and we were hopeful, but he would keep the President apprised of what was going on. Quite obviously, that was not the number one topic on our minds. At least I put it out of my mind until at one point on the margins of the meeting, McFarlane asked if he could talk to the President about a different subject. So we went off in a corner, as I recall, and he told the President that it was a very convoluted arrangement in which a plane would go to a warehouse in Portugal or some other such spot and would pick up arms there and would fly them to Israel. They would then go to one or another city in Iran, and at the same time they were making arrangements to try to get hostages out. It was a very complicated maneuver. And he said he would keep the President up on whether or not it had happened. We heard nothing more about it until after we got back from Geneva, in which he said that the thing apparently hadn't gone satisfactorily, the wrong shipment had been made, so on.
All right. And he made it clear that that the item that was being delivered was Hawk missiles or some type of munitions.
Oh, yes.
All right. Now, in fact, even prior to going to Geneva, Mr. McFarlane had told you and the President that something such as that was being contemplated and may take place. Isn't that correct?
Yes, but I don't recall whether or not he said Hawk missiles at that time. Certainly he said Hawk missiles in Geneva.
Okay. And you and the President understood that Israel would want replenishment of the material that it sent to Iran?
Yes, but as I recall, it was a lot more than 25, or something in the neighborhood of 80.
Okay. What did the President say he would do about the matter of replenishment?
Well, let's see what happens.
Again, he didn't rule that out.
He didn't rule it out. He didn't roll it in. He didn't make a commitment.
After returning from Geneva, a meeting of the senior advisors to the President was held on December 7, 1985. You recall that meeting?
Yes, I do.
All right, before we get to that meeting, just briefly, Admiral Poindexter has testified that the President signed a finding, a presidential covert action finding, on December 5, which had been prepared by the CIA. Now, your records reflect that you were present at the December 5 daily briefing that Mr. McFarland, Admiral Poindexter had with the President. Do you have any recollection of the President signing a finding on that day?
Absolutely none. I do not know anything about that finding, or I don't recall the President signing it. I don't recall it going through the normal paperwork flow. I know nothing of that finding. I've racked my brain since I've read about it in the press that you've had testimony to that effect. I've checked with my members of the staff, the White House staff, who were working with me at that time, as to whether they remember it. No one can remember seeing that document.
But you've already described a procedure whereby material could be presented to the President by the National Security Advisor without you even being aware of it.
That is possible. I'm not saying it did happen. That's possible, but I certainly did not see that document.
Right. And on occasions, although you can't say, of course, that it happened with regard to this finding, on occasions, the President was, in fact, presented with material that didn't pass through you.
That is correct.
Right. At the meeting of December 7, 1985, Secretary Schultz, Secretary Weinberger, and you opposed the idea of going forward any further with this matter. What were your objections to it at that time?
It's an old Wall Street expression that I used, cut your losses. We had taken a chance here. We thought it was an endeavor that was worth exploring. We weren't getting anywhere. 5 or 6 months had passed. It didn't look like it was going anywhere. Why bother? Cut your losses, get out of it.
In other words, would it be fair to say they were practical objections to the fact that it just wasn't succeeding?
That's right.
Right. What was the President's, what was the President's view during that session?
I think he was disappointed that there was no success, that we weren't able to open up any dialogue with Iran. I know that he still wanted something, but he said, well, I think our compromise was that McFarland would go to London, talk to those Iranian representatives, and tell them that we were getting nowhere and cut the thing off. And let it go at that and see what else would happen.
All right. When Mr. McFarland returned from London, he recommended that the entire operation be aborted or terminated. Is that correct?
Yeah, as I recall, he was quite disgusted with the sleazy type of characters that he had met there.
All right. And he conveyed that impression to you and the President?
He did.
All right. In early January, Admiral Poindexter talked to you further about this matter, very early January, leading up to a January 7 meeting, and expressed the opinion that he felt this matter ought to go forward. Is that correct?
That's right.
All right. What did he tell you at that time was new or up in the air about this matter?
I don't recall whether this was on Air Force One on the way back from California and a meeting that the President had with President de la Madrid. It could have been there. If it weren't, it was certainly the next day, that he had said something new had come up in the Iranian situation, that I'm not sure he said Israel, but he said an Israeli had come up with a new plan that would seem to be feasible, that we possibly could open up a second channel. Perhaps we could talk to people of a higher rank within Iran. He thought it was something worth exploring.
Right. At any rate, he left you, or he told you specifically, that there was a new channel to Iran, a new way of getting to the government?
Possibility of a new channel.
Okay. Did he tell you that the contact with the government of Iran was still Ghorbanifar?
Well, Ghorbanifar was mixed up in it, but he was not to be the principal one, as I understood it.
Well, did he tell you that the contact within the government of Iran was the same individual that Ghorbanifar had been dealing with in the past?
The implication was that it would be an additional or a better contact within the Iranian government.
Did Admiral Poindexter say that anything had happened to improve Mr. Ghorbanifar chances of getting the hostages released by this process?
I don't recall that.
Did he tell you that the Israelis and Iranians were now talking about 4,000 tows as opposed to 100 tows back in September?
Not at that time, not initially.
At any rate, based upon Admiral Poindexter's statements to you that there was a new channel, a new opening available, or the possibility available here, this led to a January 7 meeting of the President's senior advisors. In fact, I think it was an NSPG meeting.
Well, there was a January
particular.
6th meeting before that.
All right. Well, let's talk about the January 6th meeting first. You were present at the daily briefing of the President on that day, according to your records.
Yes,
Admiral Poindexter discussed a new proposed finding with you and the President.
that's right.
Is that the meeting you're referring
And
to?
the Vice President.
Excuse me. And that's
Yes.
the meeting you're referring to. All right. He had a proposed finding with him that he gave to the President and discussed with him?
Yes.
Right. And this was the day before the NSPG meeting to
That's
discuss the matter. All right. Now, Exhibit 14, if you'll turn to that for a second. Exhibit 14 is a signed presidential covert action finding dated January 6, 1986. It shows the President's signature on the bottom. First of all, do you have any specific recollection that this was the finding presented to the President on that day?
Well, I knew a finding was presented to the President on that day, and I assume this is it.
All right. Now, did you understand during that meeting that this was a covert action finding that the President was supposed to actually execute on that day to move forward?
No. As I understood what this was a pre-brief of the President anticipatory to the meeting that he would have on January 7th, so that he would know what the issues were and what type of decision he would be asked to make at the January 7th meeting.
How did it come to be signed?
I don't know. I think it had to be an error, because it isn't normal that the President would sign a draft such as this. Notice that this one, does not have the normal appearance of a finding. I have to think that this was the start of the process and inadvertently signed.
At the meeting of January 7th, you expressed the view of moving forward with this initiative. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess I'm a born loser. Having lost it the first time around, why try it again? Well, it seemed, again, a worthwhile effort. I come back to the fact that it is important that we have contacts with Iran. We must do all we can to maintain some liaison there in hopes of continuing it to be at least neutral, if not pro-Western. And accordingly, if we could make contacts higher up in that government, all right, let's try it again.
But a large part of your thinking at that time had to do with the information that Admiral Poindexter had given you after coming back from the Christmas vacation.
Oh, it was based entirely on what I had been told. I had no first-hand knowledge of this. I hadn't participated in any conversations with any of the other people.
Now, do you recall that at the January 7th meeting, first of all, Secretary Schultz was present, is that correct?
Yes.
Secretary Weinberger?
Yes.
The Attorney General?
Yes.
All right. Now, do you recall that the plan that was discussed during that meeting involved 4,000 tows total?
Up to 4,000 tows. It was not to be 4,000 tows all at once, but it would, that permission was being sought to utilize up to 4,000 tows.
All right. And part of the plan was that a first shipment of 1,000 tows, missiles, would be sent to Iran, in exchange for which all of the hostages would be released, all of the hostages. Is that correct?
Yes.
That was the plan that was discussed then?
Yes.
All right. And at the January 7th meeting, Secretary Weinberger expressed some concerns about the legality of this operation. Do you recall that?
I don't recall it being Secretary Weinberger. It's probable that he did so, but I know somebody raised objections.
About the legality?
Yes.
All right. Did the Attorney General express an opinion about the legality at that meeting?
As I recall, he did, and he assured us that this would be legal if there were a finding.
Did he indicate the basis for that opinion?
I don't recall his giving the basis. He may have.
Well, did he tell you or the group that he had read the statute and recalled reading an opinion of his predecessor from 5 years before?
I do recall somebody bringing that up, and it's possible it was the Attorney General about the William French Smith opinion.
Do you recall him indicating that he had done any kind of, had his staff do any kind of research back at Justice?
No, I don't recall that amount of detail.
And the President decided at that meeting on January 7th that he wanted to move forward with this?
Yes.
All right. And on January 17th, he signed a presidential covert action finding. Now,
No, he didn't.
All right.
No, he didn't.
What happened?
As I recall, what happened was, this was very brief. During part of the regular 9:30 meeting, there were other subjects discussed, and oh, by the way, we have that finding from the January 7th. It was not shown to the President. He was briefed orally by the National Security Advisor, assured that it was in line with what he had seen on January 6th and what had been discussed at January 7th, was in accordance with his wishes. I do not recall the President signing that document.
All right, sir. Well, if you'll turn to Exhibit 17 in your book.
Yeah.
You have that? Mm-hmm. That is a presidential covert action finding dated at the bottom January 17, 1986.
Yep.
And the signature of Ronald Reagan appears on it.
That's right.
All right. Is it your testimony then that what you're saying is you don't specifically recall the President signing this document?
That's right. I don't remember signing it, but that certainly is his signature.
When did you first discover that the President had signed a finding on January 17th allowing this matter to go forward?
Sometime in October of 1986, Bill Casey called me to ask if I had a copy of the finding of January. I asked my staff to see if we had a copy in our files. We had none. I went back to him and said, no, I don't have one. Ask John Poindexter. I said, how come you don't have one? He said, we don't have one in our files. And he said, that's why I'm trying to find one. So I didn't realize that the thing had been signed or where it was until late October of '86.
So you're saying that in late October of 1986, after this operation had been going forward for 8, 9, 10 months, neither you nor Director Casey had specific knowledge that the President had signed a finding dated January 17?
I think both of us, well, I shouldn't characterize what he was thinking, but I'll say I was thinking that all along I just assumed that he probably had signed it. I just didn't see it.
Right. And you couldn't locate a copy, and the Director of Central Intelligence couldn't locate a copy?
That's correct.
All right. You finally did determine who had the only copy of that finding, is that right?
Yes.
Who did you call?
I asked Poindexter about it the next day. I said, did Casey call you about that finding? He said, yes. I said, where the hell's it been? Excuse my language. That's normal for me. Excuse me. And he said, I've got the only copy. It's in my safe. He says, it's been with me.
Moving back to the January-February time frame, in late February, you and the President were aware that 1,000 TOW missiles had been shipped to Iran from the United States?
Yes.
All right. The President knew of and approved those shipments?
Yes.
And under the plan that had been discussed with the senior advisors in January, upon the shipment of this first 1,000 TOW missiles, all of the American hostages held in Lebanon were supposed to be released. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
All right. When no hostages were released after shipment of those TOW missiles, what did you recommend the President do about the fact that the Iranians had broken their word?
I told him I thought we ought to break it off, that, we'd been snookered again. And how many times, do we put up with this rug merchant type of stuff? And all words to that effect.
All right. What was the President's attitude or decision?
I think he shared my view that, we'd been had.
Well, did he instruct anyone to terminate their activities?
No, there was a pause then, and I sort of lost track of what was going on. At that point, we were deep in the middle of the tax bill and the budget battle, and I sort of lost track of, what was going on. I wasn't paying that much attention to it.
Well, it popped back up during the Tokyo summit in May of 1986 when Secretary Shultz came to you and was very concerned about something. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Right. And what do you recall him telling you at that time?
Has the man's name been mentioned in open hearing? It has. He told me that Ambassador Price had called him to alert him to the fact that Tiny Rowlands, a British business person, was inquiring about whether or not we were engaged in shipping arms to Iran, that he was being offered I suppose you'd say, a share in the underwriting of this, and wanted to know, was this indeed U.S. policy? And when I heard the name Rowlands involved in this, I was really concerned.
You knew of Mr. Rowlands?
By reputation.
Well, what was your concern at that time?
Well, what kind of a deal is this? Here we're going to outsiders to a British merchant banker, quote unquote, or entrepreneur, as part of Iranian arms sales. I couldn't follow, what's going on. So I told him, I said, you better get a hold of Poindexter and find out what is going on there. So he said he would. So that's the last I heard of that one.
Right. Well, Secretary Shultz has testified that it was his recollection that when he gave you this information in Tokyo, first of all, that you were alarmed. Is that, would it be fair to say that you were alarmed at this information?
Concerned, yes.
All right. It was Secretary Shultz's recollection that you stated to him that you would attempt to bring it to the President's attention.
I don't recall that. I'm not sure that I thought that of sufficient importance to involve the President.
Well, if you were alarmed and you felt that this matter was possibly now in the hands of some people that you didn't particularly trust, why didn't you feel that this was something, particularly given the fact that after the February shipment, when no hostages were released, you felt that this matter ought to be terminated? Why didn't you bring it to the President's attention at that point?
Well, knowing that the Secretary of State was aware of this information, having made my concerns known to the Secretary of State, and he in turn reflecting those views to the National Security Advisor, I felt that those were two very competent people who could handle the situation and would. There was no need for me to be going either around them or bringing something directly to the President that was really in their purview. I was trying to keep channels, if you will, or keep these things in channels.
Did you ever talk to the President about this matter? I mean, around that time frame.
Around that time, no.
All right. Did you check back with Secretary Shultz at any point to see whether he had been satisfied by Admiral Poindexter's
No.
response?
Again, you've got to remember, we're at an economic summit. I was concerned that the President was being briefed, had enough information, going over with him some of the fine points of what the heads of government were discussing, and so I put this sort of thing out of my mind.
Right. Now, in late May of 1986, the President, after Mr. McFarland's trip to Tehran, the President turned down a proposition that had been made to Mr. McFarland for the delivery of 2 hostages for the Hawk spare parts that were being shipped through Israel. The President and Mr. McFarland had insisted that all the hostages be released before any more parts would be delivered. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
All right. By November of 1986, the President had authorized the delivery of all of the Hawk parts, 500 additional tow missiles, and 2 pallets of medicine, all in return for those same 2 hostages. Why did our negotiating position collapse so completely during that time frame?
I cannot offer you an explanation of that. I don't know.
Right. Well, as someone who came to government service from a phenomenal career on Wall Street, it must have occurred to you that the United States was being hustled.
It was a bait and switch.
Right. Did you so advise the President?
Yeah.
All right. And what did the President say about why he was allowing this thing to continue?
Well, I think he assumed that there are many times when a political leader has to deal with unsavory characters in order to accomplish an end. And I think he was under the impression, well, if we can get to the top there, someplace toward the top in Iran, perhaps, you know, we can deal with them, but we got to work our way up the ladder. Any of those people are criminals. They're in jail properly. I'll never ask him to release those. And as far as overthrowing the government of Iraq, that was not our policy, and I never heard that being brought up to the president.
Well, it was also not our policy to be selling arms to Iran, but this was never discussed in the president's...
Again, you got to remember the circumstances under which we did this. This was the exception proving the rule.
Had anybody ever indicated to the president in your presence, or had the president ever stated that it would be all right to at least talk about these matters with the Iranians, even if we didn't intend to do anything about it?
Not about the Dawa prisoners, absolutely not, or not the overthrow of Saddam, you know, I mean, in Iraq.
Right. That would be those types of promises that were not going to be kept would not be consistent with the idea of a new vision of a new bilateral relationship with Iran, would they?
That's right.
Right. Now that brings us to the events of November 1986. Your contemporaneous notes indicate that you were a proponent of going public with this information.
Absolutely.
Early on.
Absolutely.
Right. What was your reasoning there?
Well, here's a breaking story that whether it's breaking in Beirut or breaking anywhere, that I could see was not going to stop. I recall discussing with other members of the staff, the cover is blown here. We've got to go public with it. We've got to tell the Congress, we've got to tell the American public exactly what went on, so they're aware of it.
What did Admiral Poindexter recommend?
Absolutely not. It was later reported in a local paper here that we had a shouting match. We didn't have a shouting match, but we did have a difference of opinion, a strong one.
A vigorous.
His reasoning was a good one, that Jacobson had just come out as a hostage. North was preparing to go to London, and actually did go to London that first weekend in November. What was it, the 8th and 9th and through there. And there was the possibility of 2 more prisoners coming out, 2 of the original ones, and maybe even the additional 3, the later ones. And why blow that chance? We've got to keep the lid on this. We've got to deny it. We're endangering their lives. And then I might add here, a very dramatic thing happened. I recall it vividly. Jacobson had a Rose Garden ceremony welcoming him back. He had said in his remarks, he had cautioned the media about discussing this. On the way back, as the President and he were mounting the steps to the colonnade to go back into the Oval Office, there were shouted questions from the media about, what are you going to do about the hostages? What about the others that are there? And Jacobson turned and very emotionally said, for God's sakes, don't talk about that. That's exactly what I've been saying. You're endangering the lives of people I love. These are my friends. That made quite an impression on the President. And even though that same day I urged him again to get this story out, he said, no, we can't, Don. He said, we can't endanger those lives. And he didn't. I did get him to promise, though, that on November 10th, Monday, we could have a meeting to discuss just how much we could reveal.
And that meeting was held on November 10.
Yes.
All right. We have as exhibits here the notes of Mr. Keel, who attended that meeting, and also your notes. They are exhibits 41 and 41A. If you'll turn to 41A for a moment. Now, those are notes in your handwriting?
They are.
All right, they're fairly complete. In fact, they're about 14, 15 pages worth of notes. You were keeping pretty extensive notes of the ongoing discussion, is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And at this meeting, Admiral Poindexter, toward the beginning, gave a general history of this operation for the assemblage. Is that right?
That's right.
All right. And in this presentation to the group, he said that a total